All right, I'm going to get started. I think most of everyone who's going to join us today has already. If they're not, they'll be trailing in a moment. Um, First of all, welcome. I am Jeff Cooley from Boston College, and on behalf of myself, Ronfred Lessing-Tella of Wichita State University, and Sarah Milstein of the University of British Columbia, I welcome you to our conference, Jehu's Tribute, What Can Biblical Studies Offer Assyriology? Thank you for joining us. Please note, if you intend on attending tomorrow's gathering as well, you will need to register for that day separately. You'll find tomorrow's registration icon at the top of that day's schedule on the conference's program schedule and registration webpage. What's the genesis of this event? At the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in 2019, Ronfred and Sarah, the former the co-chair of the Assyriology and the Bible section, the latter the chair of the Hebrew Scriptures and Cognate Literature section, simultaneously approached each other with the idea of holding a special joint session at the Society's 2020 gathering in Boston on this very topic. The steering committee of the Assyriology and the Bible section immediately proceeded with planning this, and in the early months of 2020, the session took shape in both our minds and in the Society of Biblical Literature's conference planning software. Then the pandemic created a myriad of inconveniences and indeed tragedies, and it dramatically altered SBL's 2020 meeting. When that happened, Ron and I, in consultation with our steering committee and Sarah, agreed to cancel the special session. Rather than allowing this important topic to be smothered by SBL's necessary but novel technologies and format, we decided that it would be worthwhile to hold a standalone conference based on that original slate of invitees, expanding with invited respondents. This would furthermore allow many others who would not normally have attended the SBL to join us. Boston College was able to offer its financial support through its Institute for the Liberal Arts. And we are thankful for that backing and would like to acknowledge it. Of particular note are Julia Barrett and Gauri Pandey for assisting us with the conference's technologies and advertising. Furthermore, we are thankful to the steering committee of the Assyriology and Bible section of the SBL, namely Peter Machinist, Shalom Holtz, Joanne Skurlock, and Gina Konstantopoulos, for their planning and original work as well. I'd like to thank my good friend and senior colleague here at Boston College, David Vanderhooft, for his support and invaluable advice as we transformed an SBL session to its own event. Now, regarding our question, while our question might seem to be an obvious query for many of those in attendance here, the fact is it's been largely unexplored, primarily due to the well-documented history of our disciplinary boundaries. The resulting situation is one in which, even after a century of Assyriology pursued for its own sake on the one hand, and the continuing reconceptualization of Israel and Judah as ancient Near Eastern cultures on the other, the flow of methods, data, and insights continues to move primarily from Assyriology to biblical studies. It's as if the latter was the sole proprietor of epistemological dimness and uniquely merited illumination. No doubt, there are clearly other dynamics in play, and I admit that this is a bit of a gross caricature, but it's not, I think, too far off the mark. The fact that we have well over 100 people in attendance today is a clear indicator that there's something to this question. The end of the matter is this: if the literature of Israel and Judah is truly the product of peoples of the ancient Near East who, over the course of several centuries, had significant interaction with both Assyria and Babylonia, then surely the study of the Hebrew Bible has something to offer Assyriology. But what? Now, regarding our meeting's process, each day we have 3 speakers, followed by 2 respondents. Each speaker will talk for around 30 minutes, then our respondents will, respond. I'm sorry, get tired of looking up synonyms. After this, we have 25 minutes allotted for our speakers to react and answer and to field other questions from the attendees, which you are welcome to submit by clicking on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Today's session will focus on larger questions on the history of our field and its public face, while tomorrow's will feature more focused studies. So let me welcome the first of today's speakers, the Hancock Research Professor of Hebrew and Other Oriental Languages at Harvard University, Peter Machinist. Peter, you're welcome to put your camera on and unmute yourself.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here, and I feel honored to be invited to open our proceedings for these next 2 days. My talk, as advertised, is entitled Ashur, Babel, and Bibel, Reflections on the History of Biblical and Mesopotamian Scholarship. And I intend this to serve as a kind of background for the talks and responses that will follow. I should begin with 2 problematic definitions of what I'm going to say and what perhaps the conference as a whole will deal with. The first is the question of the Hebrew Bible versus ancient Israel. The second is, in comparable fashion, focused on Mesopotamia versus cuneiform civilization. Both of these pairs are obviously overlapping, but not identical, with the first element, namely Hebrew Bible and Mesopotamia, being the subordinate, though in many ways the defining element of the second, namely ancient Israel and cuneiform civilization. In this paper, my focus will be respectively the Hebrew Bible and Mesopotamia, but from time to time, the discussion will venture into ancient Israel and cuneiform civilization. The Western, that is to say, dominantly the European exploration of Mesopotamia and the rest of the Near East, apart from Palestine or the southern Levant, an exploration which began in the latter 18th century, was not initially concerned, much if at all, with its biblical connections. Rather, the more general issue was the European fascination with the strange wonders of the East, ancient and later, the desire to find in the East cultural origins for these Europeans that could predate those furnished by the civilizations of Greece and Rome. In turn, bringing tangible evidence of such origins back to Europe in the form of the ancient monuments became part of an effort to claim hegemony, political, cultural, and spiritual, over this Eastern world, and so to compete with one another for title to this hegemony. Ab initio, therefore, the European exploration of the East involved a quest for European roots and simultaneously for evidence against which to assert European progress and achievement. The point of departure for the biblical connection to this European quest began, as we all know, roughly in the mid-19th century, more specifically in the 1840s with the British and French explorations of several ancient Assyrian capitals in what is now northern Iraq, namely Nineveh, Kalach or Nimrud, and Dur-Sharrukin or Khorsabad. These discoveries initiated an explosion of further archaeological work in the latter 19th and early 20th centuries, which involved other Western nations, especially Germany and the United States, and added the other major Assyrian capital, Assur, as well as systematic exploration in the Iraqi south, namely Babylonia, to the picture that had been developing. Already by the 1850s and 60s, as the texts and monuments were brought to Europe and began to be deciphered, it became clear that the Assyria uncovered was the same Assyria rather copiously referred to in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in its historical and prophetic books. In this way, biblical connections emerged as an increasingly popular, even urgent concern. Important here is to note that what was going on archaeologically in Mesopotamia paralleled the partially contemporaneous exploration of ancient Egypt, the other major ancient Near Eastern civilization. But it is significant that while Egypt also has more than a little visibility in the Hebrew Bible, its connections to the Bible in ancient Israel did not enjoy the same attention in the scholarship of the 19th century, and even to some degree later, as did Mesopotamia. I might suggest that the reason for this is perhaps the overall culture and history of Egypt had less obvious ties to biblical culture, and its language, unlike the Semitic Akkadian of Mesopotamia, was less directly related to biblical Hebrew and Aramaic. In the balance of my paper today, I want to look at the ways in which scholarship of the last couple of centuries came to view the connections between Mesopotamia and the Hebrew Bible of ancient Israel. I'll do so through an admittedly rapid, brief, and selected review of some key scholars and scholarly moments in this still lively discussion. And these are listed for you, and I will go over them briefly in the handout, which you can find available on the chat. There are 11 of them. Following this rapid review, I want to offer an attempt, again somewhat brief, but I hope provocative, to discern some of the broader issues at stake as these concern the comparative study of cultures altogether. So let me ask you then to look at the list of scholarly moments or episodes in this history of the study of biblical Mesopotamian scholarship that again are on the chat list. Let me review them briefly. We start with George Smith, the brilliant young Assyriologist who joined the British Museum in 1867 to decipher and put together the fragments excavated, particularly by Layard and then eventually Rassam, and brought to the British Museum. I'll come back to him in a moment. Following him is Eberhard Schrader, who was the first to have a full academic professorship in Assyriology in Germany at the University of Berlin in 1875, and was responsible for a final discussion, if you will, and the establishment of the decipherment of cuneiform and the basic understanding of Akkadian, and the publication of a book that went through 3 editions called Keilschrift Inschriften und das Alte Testament, which brought together texts from the Hebrew Bible with the inscriptions that were then in the process of decipherment. Julius Wellhausen, the famous German Old Testament scholar, is our 3rd entry. Although he did not work directly on cuneiform, he wrote and published a very important article on the decipherment of cuneiform and the basic structure of Akkadian, even mentioning something about Sumerian, but decided not to pursue the matter because he believed the first task, at least partially because he believed that the first task was understanding the Bible in itself. Hermann Gunkel is our 4th candidate, another Old Testament scholar whose major work in 1895, Creation and Chaos, Schöpfung und Chaos, und Urzeit und Endzeit, in primeval and eschatological time, if you will, sought to apply some of the work of decipherment of Babylonian myths to the study of both the Old and the New Testament. Number 5 is the discovery of the Susa stele with the complete collection of the Hammurabi laws in 1902 and published almost immediately thereafter by Jean-Vincent Scheil, which opened up the whole question of the relationship of the Mesopotamian legal tradition with that in the Bible, particularly the covenant code in the book of Exodus. Number 6 is the famous controversy initiated by the then commanding Assyriologist in Europe, if not in the world, Friedrich Delitzsch, in his so-called Babel und Bibel lectures of 1902 to 1904. And the very controversial and vehement reaction to these. Number 7 is a kind of response to the Babel and Bibel lectures, although it does not mention this explicitly, namely the inaugural lecture by Benno Landsberger in 1926 when he was made Außerordentlicher Professor, roughly associate professor of Assyriology at the University of Leipzig. His famous essay, starting as this lecture, Die Eigenbegrifflichkeit der babylonischen Welt, as it's been translated, the conceptual autonomy of the Babylonian world, proved to be formative for the next generation of Assyriologists. Number 8 is William Foxwell Albright, and I will defer here to my colleague Alice Mandell, who will follow, except to note simply that he started really as an Assyriologist, along with many other studies, but his dissertation on the Assyrian deluge epic typified his early work in his career from roughly 1913 to 1927, which had a very heavy amount of Assyriological material in it. Number 9 is devoted to the study of the site of Nuzi, which began to be excavated in the 1920s and into the early 30s, and the scholarship that was produced on that basis, in which the argument was made that a number of the social and religious practices at Nuzi found inviting parallels in the practices labeled for the patriarchs in the biblical book of Genesis. Something similar follows in number 10, which is about the site of Mari, whose excavations started in 1933, and with fits and starts are still potentially in the works, although the Syrian civil war has stopped that in 2011. Here again, parallels between the social organization and practices as indicated in the Mari text with those in the Bible, particularly in Genesis, became an item of concern. And finally, I want to talk about the Neo-Assyrian Empire and its impact on the Hebrew Bible and ancient Israel. This was prominent in the early days of Assyriology, latter 19th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, it took a backseat to other foci in Assyriology, namely of the 3rd and 2nd millennia. But as I look at the picture, after the Second World War, more particularly in the late 1940s, there began a renewal of interest in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, initiated, it seems to me, by the renewed British excavations at the Neo-Assyrian capital of Kalach, or Nimrud. We'll talk a little bit further about those. In reviewing these 11 case studies, as it were, I would just here like to make a brief set of further remarks on several of them. First, with George Smith, our first indicator. What's important, I think, about his research as it has an impact on the Mesopotamian biblical connection is twofold. His interest in Mesopotamian culture and its texts, particularly myths and legends. It was, after all, his decipherment of the flood narrative in Gilgamesh Tablet 11 and his public lecture on it, and put together in a book form in the year that he died, 1876, which got things going. But as Chaim Tadmor has emphasized, we should not forget also Smith's interest in a second group of textual materials that had an impact on the biblical Mesopotamian connection, namely the cuneiform texts on political history, particularly Neo-Assyrian political history, including royal inscriptions and the so-called Assyrian eponym canon. These twofold foci on cultural texts on the one hand and on texts involving political history on the other seem to run as a kind of thread through much of the history of modern scholarship on our question. What does it all mean? What kinds of conclusions can one draw about the kind of analysis exemplified in these 11 case studies that deal with the issue of cultural comparison? The timeline that I've given you runs roughly from the virtual beginning of Assyriology in the mid-19th century until the present. As we've seen, these case studies illustrate the two major trends in the scholarship on Mesopotamica Biblica, involving texts and other artifacts, both about political or military history and about cultural phenomena like religion and law. Primary here is the issue of context, placing items to be compared within each one's own context before and yet at the same time as they are being compared, and understanding comparison to comprise various kinds of relationship, which may be included within the spectrum from relevance to irrelevance, and within relevance from identity to contrast. It is this variability and nuanced character of relationship that is often hard to discern and to articulate. Indeed, appreciating such a range of relationships has certainly bedeviled comparisons between Mesopotamica and Biblica. In the 19th and at least the first half of the 20th century, one could argue that as much as the search for biblical echoes promoted the recovery of the ancient Near East, a recovery to fill out the matrix to biblical history, this set of echoes also retarded a sensitive and balanced understanding of the non-biblical cultures of the region. There was, as is now well admitted, too much apologetic, whether implicit or explicit, among the interpreters, many or most of whom, even well into the 20th century, came from Bible backgrounds and sometimes formal theological training, and were not immune from constructing invidious contrasts between this non-biblical world and biblical Israel. Israel and its Bible in this process were, of course, viewed as the transition to the higher culture represented by the European, that is to say, the Western European tradition of the interpreters. Even an attempt like that of Friedrich Delitzsch to reverse the polarity in his Bible and Bibel lectures, namely to suggest that Mesopotamia was the dominant culture, and when the Bible borrowed from it, it was either just crassly imitative or distinctly inferior. Even this attempt to reverse the polarity, therefore, only betrayed Delitzsch's family background in Bible, his father being the most famous and best of the conservative German interpreters of the Old Testament in the 19th century. And it involved also creating, as Delitzsch did, a matching and equally disfiguring apologetic in behalf of Mesopotamia. Seen in this light, this Bible background, if you will, positions like those of Julius Wellhausen and Benno Landsberger, in which the first and predominant effort at cultural understanding must focus on the individual culture itself and its evidence, though not disallowing eventual comparison. Looking at the matter this way, you start from internally, and then eventually you might worry about external comparison. These reactions of Wellhausen and Landsberger can be appreciated as strong reactions against what these two scholars perceived as Mesopotamian biblical comparisons that were uncontrolled and disfiguring, like those of Delitzsch, but also, as we will see, Hermann Gunkel and those who indulge themselves with newsy comparisons. What then to do about Mesopotamian biblical comparisons? Indeed, about comparisons of cultures in general. Several points here are worth stating or restating, since they've been rehearsed by others more than once. Comparison, to be useful as a first point, must recognize not only the complexity of context, as I've mentioned above, but the detail needed in abundance, variety, and degree of explicitness to enhance the clarity of the relationship between the two items being compared. Where this detail is lacking, at least reasons for this should be attempted, with the potential of directing future research toward discovering what is missing. Here, the two major categories of Mesopotamian biblical connections, namely its political military history and its cultural phenomena, come into play. The political military history trend tends to involve explicitness, that is, looking for notices of actual connections between Mesopotamian texts and the Bible, thus pointing toward, but not necessarily certifying, real historical contacts. So, for example, the Assyrian Sennacherib's third campaign to the southern Levant, which included Judah, this is related, as is well known, in both biblical and Assyrian sources, and that serves as a point of departure for what is then done with these materials. But in the second category of contact involving cultural phenomena, explicitness is not often to be found. Indeed, it seems rare. Thus, the claimed contacts between legal prescriptions in the Hammurabi laws and in the biblical covenant code are not supported by an explicit statement in either text about the relationship to the other. And so the case of contacts is often harder to establish than for texts about political or military history. Of course, the distinction between sources on political and military history and those on cultural phenomena, this distinction is not always rigid and clear-cut. Each category can involve something of the other, complicating the evaluation of the contacts proposed. So, for example, the biblical narrative about Sennacherib's campaign mentions the sudden departure of the Assyrian troops before Jerusalem because of the unexpected deaths of many of them in their camp. But this incident is nowhere to be found in the Assyrian sources for the campaign. How then is the biblical story to be evaluated for historical accuracy? Is it due to some kind of tendentiousness on the part of the biblical author, or is its absence from the Assyrian sources a matter of tendentiousness there? A second point about comparison is that its aim must be defined. Why is the comparison needed? Is there something in item A in its cultural complex that is not clear on its own, but has the possibility of being clarified by something in item B in its complex? Gunkel here thought so, with what he perceived as the remnants in the Hebrew Bible of a myth about cosmic creation. Remnants, he argued, that could only be made coherent and meaningful by reference to the Babylonian myth of Enuma Elish, which had recently been deciphered when he wrote about this. And for Gunkel, this Enuma Elish offered the complete mythic story of creation that must therefore have been the matrix of the biblical remnants. Whether Gunkel was right to look at Enuma Elish in this way is not the point here. It is the kind of question he asked about the Bible that is important. The character of the comparison is a third feature that must be attended to. Is the comparison meant to be genetic historical, where the items being compared are understood to come out of some kind of actual historical connection between them? Or is the comparison typological functional, where the items are compared because in their respective cultural environments, they operate in meaningfully the same, similar, or contrastive ways, but without any assumption of actual historical contact, save only the general one that the similarities or contrasts are the result of how human beings in general act. Much of the past work on Mesopotamian biblical comparisons, exemplified by the 11 cases you can consult, appears to have been focused on genetic historical comparisons and not taken sufficient care to reflect on typological or functional ones. Certainly much, if not most, of the work involving the category of political or military history falls into genetic or historical comparisons. Now, if the comparison is intended to be genetic historical, it is crucial to identify as much as possible the channels of transmission for the connection, and then to be as clear as possible about where this identification of channel is incomplete and why. Here, of course, one may be reminded of the basic kinds of historical connections, and this is at the bottom of page 3 of your handout. Let me just repeat briefly what's there. If item A and item B are in direct contact or through identifiable immediate intermediaries, this is one kind of connection. Is the contact then from A to B or the reverse? Or is it some kind of reciprocal connection, like A from B and then with A's adaptation back to B? A second connection, A and B are related because they are based on C. A third possibility, A and perhaps B reflect the zeitgeist of the period to which A and B can be dated, or reflect a generalized, more chronologically longer-lived tradition of the region, all, however, without a more specific point of historical contact. Then we must add one other point, to which Professor Cooley has already adverted at the beginning of this conference. What about comparisons between A and B? They must be looked at from both sides, namely of B's impact, whether it's genetic, historical, or typological, functional, of B's impact on the understanding of A, but we must also look at A's impact on the understanding of B. It appears, at least until recently, that the bulk of Mesopotamian biblical comparisons, again as exemplified in our 11 cases, has been of Mesopotamian impact on the understanding of the Bible or Israel, not of the Bible or Israel on Mesopotamia. This imbalance, again, as Professor Cooley has mentioned and is in the written announcement of our conference, this imbalance needs to be addressed. Let me illustrate as a final point in the present paper with two examples. The first is the Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions and the biblical first Isaiah. This connection has been studied, as many of you know already, by many, including myself. By far, the major focus has been on the impact on Isaiah. Isaiah's adaptation, in other words, of the ideology or propaganda proclaimed in the Assyrian royal inscriptions. But looked at from Isaiah back to the inscriptions, the connection is also revelatory, showing that in Isaiah, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was seen very much within the frame, though the individual elements could be reworked, that the empire itself had set through its own propaganda. Far from giving another differently based view of Assyria, as we might have initially expected, the evidence of Isaiah becomes an important witness to the official Assyrian perspective and to its pervasiveness, both generally and specifically on the development of Israelite thought. And to my final example of this, again, impact of Israel and Bible on the outer world. This has to do with the cylinder of Cyrus II and the biblical second Isaiah. You see, I love Isaiah. Here too, there has been much discussion focused on the statements attributed to the God Yahweh in 2nd Isaiah chapters 44 and 45, to the effect that Cyrus is Yahweh's shepherd and anointed, whose right hand Yahweh has grasped and whom he has named. These statements are, rightly I think, echoes of what Cyrus says in his cylinder, namely that he is the favorite of the god Marduk, who grasps Cyrus's hand and names him. Now, one modern interpretation of all of this has been that the Isaiah reference is only a deliberate subversion of the reference in the Cyrus cylinder, an ironical, even satirical rejection, in other words, of a Marduk theology. That may be, but if so, the irony or satire here is quite implicit. More importantly, such an interpretation cannot be the whole matter, based as it is simply on the perspective of the cylinder's impact on Isaiah. An added perspective appears if the Isaiah reference is looked at as an external witness to Cyrus's theology, or better, political ideology. For like Yahweh, Marduk was not Cyrus's personal god. And as several scholars have argued, particularly Morton Smith, when Cyrus's cylinder and the Isaiah reference are put side by side, they testify to Cyrus's uncanny political program of proclaiming his legitimacy as imperial ruler by appealing to the local chief gods of his various subjects. Thus, Marduk for the Babylonians of the Cyrus cylinder, and Yahweh for the Judahites of Isaiah. In sum, then, the relationship between Mesopotamia and the biblical world of Israel is an ongoing project, open to a constant stream of new discoveries and the refinement or elimination of old methods, and also to new questions. This relationship is valuable, not only for the insights each culture can provide on the other, but as a fertile testing ground for the field of cultural comparison altogether. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that overview and that validation of our question here. We don't have the ability to. I don't think in the webinar context we have the ability to necessarily applaud, have an applaud feature or anything like that. But I'm sure everyone is applauding at home. And is perhaps trying to convince their family that they're not insane for applauding a computer screen. Thank you very much. We can get to your questions to you at the end of our session here. I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is our next speaker, who holds the William Foxwell Albright Chair of Biblical and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the Johns Hopkins University, Alice Mandell. Hi, Alice.
Hey. Do I have your green light to start my PowerPoint? Great.
Yes, please.
Okay. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Awesome. So first of all, I wanted to thank everyone who organized this event. And I see the names of many friends and colleagues in the participation box, and some of my students and former cohort members of different groups I've been a part of. And it's lovely to just see your names. I think this is a really wonderful event, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. I was initially asked by the organizers of this conference to speak about Albright's legacy and to consider what biblical studies can do for Assyriology. The title of the conference, Jehu's Tribute, is a play on a key critique that has been voiced by Assyriologists in the past about how biblical studies has engaged with Assyriology. In the first millennium BCE, the Levant was used and exploited for its resources, people, and the strategic access that it afforded to trade networks. It is both fair and accurate to say that in the history of scholarship of our fields, as Peter Machinist just talked about, this relationship was flipped. Biblical scholars in the closely intertwined field of biblical archaeology in the 20th century CE viewed Mesopotamia as a rich resource that could be mined to access the world behind the biblical text. As a region poor in inscriptions, the study of the Southern Levant was dependent upon the textual remains of adjacent regions and the evidence for their scribal traditions. My field did not take interest in the academic discipline of Assyriology, and we too often cherry-picked what we needed for the purpose of developing our own regionally specific theories, frequently without crediting the hard work of cuneiformists and regional specialists in Assyriology to curate and contextualize this data. In this paper, rather than focus on this somewhat fraught history between our respective fields, I would like to take a step back and probe more deeply what it is that is left of the structure of Albright's house in the study of the ancient Levant. And I will also speak a little bit about Albright's legacy in my field and how he in turn benefited from Assyriology. And rather than offer a tribute or unsolicited advice to my friends and colleagues who are Assyriologists and are here today, I will conclude with a few observations about areas where our fields can work more closely together. I think that we share important concerns about our mutual survival as fields that are facing increased administrative and economic pressures by our respective institutions. So to begin, I would like to contextualize the title of my paper, Remodeling Albright's House. What can biblical studies in the 21st century do for Assyriology? Albright is considered by many in my field to be the father of the study of biblical archaeology and Northwest Semitic epigraphy. And as a byproduct of his style of writing and his interest in big picture synthesis, Albright also wrote some of the earliest large-scale treatments of Israelite history that incorporated archaeological materials. The title of my talk, Remodeling Albright's House, is of course in part inspired by the current COVID year and my love of HGTV. However, when I use this metaphor of house or household to describe Albright's legacy, I'm also borrowing from past works that have both praised and problematized Albright's house, as well as the so-called Baltimore and Harvard schools. The metaphor Albright's house draws a comparison between the designing, act of laying a foundation, construction, and eventual collapse of the structure, and Albright's individual work as a researcher, but also his influence on the direction of biblical studies in the US. Many, like William Deaver, who's cited here, have concluded that Albright's house has largely collapsed. And yet there is also agreement that its foundation remains intact. An approach to the study of the biblical text that is anchored in archaeology, in the study of linguistic change as tempered by epigraphic evidence, and in the study of the ancient Near East more broadly. Here, we can also benefit from the observation that the metaphor house is not merely spatial or architectural, but also signifies a social dimension that touches upon identity and boundary marking. Here I cite Frank Moore Cross, who describes Albright as the father of a household. All of us build on the solid foundations he laid. As his scholarly offspring, we are obliged to honor him. Albright's house as a construct was founded on friendships, personal and professional. Albright encouraged his students to form cohorts and to collaborate and work together, and even to co-author dissertations. And here I reference David Noel Friedman and Frank Moore Cross's many collaborations. In the many readings that I did to prepare this paper, there was a resounding theme. Many of Albright's students saw themselves as part of a larger academic family. And Albright's mentorship did not end when they left their graduate training. In Albright's hagiography and other biographical works, he is described kind of as a god. He is a towering figure, both paternal and patriarchal, awesome in his anger and intimidating in his physical and intellectual stature. It is clear that he was beloved by his students, but also feared by many, especially those who were not considered to be Albright's boys. Delbert Hillers describes his reaction when Albright made a favorable note of him in a publication. He writes, "I felt that it was like having one's name written in the book of life." This reverence carried over to scholars who were not actually Albright students, but considered themselves to be a part of his academic genealogy. By way of a somewhat, I think, funny, but also more extreme example, I cite Larry Herr's experience in the basement of what is today the Albright Institute of Jerusalem as a student. He describes the act of holding and tasting the pottery that Albright excavated from Tel Beit Mirzim as though an act of Holy Communion with Albright. He writes, "I was able to feel, and upon Roland de Vaux's recommendation, taste the pottery while looking at the publication. This was my single most important learning experience connected with the world of pottery. And to do it in a place pulsing with the ghost of Albright and the others who lived and worked there was almost a religious experience." We can contrast the glowing stories about Albright and his hagiography, William Foxwell Albright, the 20th century genius, with those stories of people, including Jewish scholars and women among others, who were not as welcome in this band of scholars. The darker side of this period in my field is best articulated in Burke Long's work, Planting and Reaping Albright. Long describes Albright's house as a problematic academic superstructure that dominated the field of biblical studies and biblical archaeology. This was accomplished through the programmatic crafting of Albright's cult and legacy. He argues that Albright students fortified his house and positioned themselves as the gatekeepers of the field. Today, I do not know many scholars of my generation who would describe Albright or any academic figure with the reverence used in the hagiographies of Albright and his students. And while community and membership in an intellectual circle can be valuable, I hope that we are wearier of personality cults in our respected disciplines. No one person, cohort, or school should decide for a field who is in and out. And I am hopeful that we will not replace one generation of gatekeepers with another moving into the 21st century. So what was the foundation of Albright's house? Albright's approach is best expressed in his work to develop typologies in the study of ceramics, the evolution of Northwest Semitics, and his early interest in Neo-Syrian chronology. We can further contextualize Albright's interest and engagement with measurable linguistic and archaeological data as a means of uncovering the origins of ancient Israel in his own upbringing. As many of you probably know, he was the son of a Methodist missionary. He sought to anchor the Bible in the so-called biblical world and realia. Indeed, his most cited works and those of his most famous students, David Noel Freeman and Frank Moore Cross, seek to uncover early, original, and archaic phases of Hebrew in the biblical poetic corpus using evidence from inscriptions. When we strip Albright's house of this ideological framework, perhaps it is fair to say that what is left is the training that he gave his students as their foundation to be able to properly do the study of the Levant justice, the integration of archaeology and epigraphy alongside of the biblical text. It is also important to remember, however, that Albright himself derived his very linguistic toolkit that he used to craft his own approach from his advisor, Paul Haupt, an Assyriologist. As a graduate student in the Oriental Seminary at Johns Hopkins, Albright's doctoral training in Near Eastern Studies was founded on three critical pillars: comparative Semitics, Assyriology, and biblical studies. Albright's first publications and his 1916 dissertation topic, the Assyrian Deluge epic, would most likely not have landed him a job in biblical studies today. Paul Haupt's own scholarship, his foundational work in Sumerian, but also his editing of the Polychrome Bible, reflects a time when boundaries between our respective fields were more porous, perhaps due to the simple fact that they were in their nascence. Paul Haupt ultimately impressed upon Albright the importance of a breadth of language training in the comparative method. So while Albright did not necessarily agree with, or perhaps even sometimes respect, his advisor's work in biblical studies, his own approach and that of his students was founded on his own graduate training. Ultimately, Albright's interest in typology and in identifying diagnostic evidence in language and archaeology served his ultimate goal of anchoring the Bible and its writers in specific periods in history. This interest, in turn, was part of his broader work as a scholar and a Christian humanist to track the progression of Israelite monotheism as a prelude to Christianity. Albright was not alone in this respect. During his years in Jerusalem, before he took over Paul Haupt's position at Johns Hopkins University, he was part of a cohort of researchers and non-specialists who financed archaeological work. His time in the Middle East was also characterized by a particularly USA brand of Orientalism, shared by other American scholars of this period. They viewed Palestine as a place of adventure where they could uncover the unknown. They were also anti-establishment in the sense that they sought to carve out their own approach to the study of the biblical text, both literally and figuratively in the landscape of Palestine. This was done through their excavations and building projects and through their ongoing work to safeguard the emerging field of biblical archaeology. Scholars in my field have since problematized and pushed back against some of the colonial and religious agendas that fueled and still fuel scholarship relating to ancient Israel, and this, of course, remains a work in progress. When Albright took over Paul Haupt's position at Johns Hopkins University in 1929, he trained his students in a similar fashion to how he was trained, with the addition of archaeology and ancient Near Eastern history. His academic offspring were encouraged to be conversant in archaeology and material culture, comparative Semitics, the broader scripts and written languages of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, historical geography, and quote-unquote lower and higher criticism. All of this with the aims of contextualizing the Hebrew Bible in its ancient Near Eastern context. The description of the course load, as many of my students on this thread know and probably aren't so happy about, is quite similar back then as it is today. All of our students take substantive courses in other branches of Near Eastern languages, archaeology, art history, and history. They take a lot of classes. And all of the graduate students in our program, all of them, are required to take a 3-year history cycle that covers a year of each branch of our disciplines: the history of the Levant, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. In this respect, our program is still very much Albright's. Today, the interdisciplinary method that Albright advocated is not the domain of any particular school or program, but has become an internalized part of how to do the history of the Levant. It is used in the major programs in my field, where the study of the Bible is explicitly done in the framework of ancient Near Eastern studies. The diffusion of this approach is in part due to the large number of students that Albright and his students trained and their success in securing academic positions. So, for example, Albright advised 57 dissertations. His student Frank Moore Cross, who held the Hancock Chair at Harvard, advised over 100 dissertations. The students from this lineage have dominated the academic job market, editorial boards, and publishing. They also instilled the importance of this breadth of training to their own students. As a result, even those scholars who seek distance from Albright are absorbed into this legacy, as this was the model that they too inherited in their own graduate training. In the second half of the 20th century, Albright's house underwent a gut job. We are now in the salvaging and remodeling phase of my field. The same interdisciplinary model that Albright's house impressed upon the field is what gave the field the ability to deconstruct the work of the previous generation. As a byproduct of a rethinking of the relationship between the biblical text and material culture, and changes in how we think and conceptualize of categories like history and religion, or dismiss these categories, Albright's conclusions have largely been abandoned. In this, I'm speaking, of course, of the classic works by scholars like John Van Seters and Thomas Thompson and others in the 70s, who probed the ideological framework of Albright's house in biblical scholarship, particularly in the United States. While Albright's assumptions about the dating of the biblical text and his methodology diverged from scholars like Wellhausen, Albright's work was conditioned by the assumption of an evolutionary progression in religion, and his work and research agenda were infused with a similar interest in situating the Hebrew Bible as a conduit and precursor for Christianity. The deconstruction of biblical archaeology was also inevitable. The archaeology of the Southern Levant became its own highly specialized and developed field. Scholars such as Bill Deaver in the US, Israel Finkelstein, members of the Tel Aviv School, Tom Levy, multiple archaeologists, Aaron Burke, have challenged the aims and conclusions of biblical archaeology. They have problematized the use of the biblical text to guide, or actually to define, the interpretation of Israel's material culture. Here I'm, of course, speaking about the pushback to the Bible and spade paradigm, but also talking about ongoing debates about the very nomenclature that we use to talk about archaeology in the Levant: biblical archaeology, Syro-Palestinian archaeology, or more contemporarily, Levantine archaeology. Scholars have also harnessed the epigraphic and archaeological record to offer a counter-narrative to past claims about the uniqueness of Israel's material culture and religion. In the end, the deconstruction of biblical archaeology opened up the study of the Iron Age Levant to scholars who used biblical and archaeological materials in their work, but whose identities, interests, and motivations were quite different from that of Albright's boys. Scholars such as Elizabeth Block Smith, Carol Myers, Judith Hadley, Susan Ackerman, Beth Halpern Akai, for example, have opened a window into the important economic, ritual, social, and political roles of women in the Southern Levant. And most recently, Christine Garraway has examined the lives of children who are even less represented in the biblical text. So what's left of Albright's house? It is perhaps in this context of deconstruction and remodeling that we should contextualize what the study of the Levant can do for Assyriology. As a result of the debates regarding the dating, composition, and transmission of the biblical texts, scholars in my field have had to grapple with the ideologies behind these texts and those created through them. The biblical text in and of itself is seen as an agent of cultural transformation. To quote Gail Yee, it is a persuasive force forming opinion, making judgments and exerting change. Biblical scholars today are also more open to using methodologies outside of the field of biblical studies and ancient Near Eastern studies to probe the different voices, aims, and interests of the writers, but also the audiences of the biblical text. Indeed, this is perhaps where the close relationship in my field between the study of texts and archaeology comes into play, as the integration of both data sets gives us a more balanced perspective of the diverse facets of the Southern Levant, which included those people either left out or minimally addressed in inscriptions and in the biblical text. Whereas our academic ancestors took the text perhaps overly at face value, scholars in my field no longer view the Hebrew Bible to be a necessarily bounded or fixed thing, but speak of the fluidity of this corpus into the Roman period. And while the biblical text speaks to the local power of Israel and Judah, the archaeology of the Southern Levant paints a dramatically different picture, speaking to the inverse of the realia of the power dynamics that Albright himself studied. The Hebrew Bible was largely composed in response to the trauma of the first millennium. The writings of ancient Israel and Judah both reflect and do the work of identity creation, particularly as a response to the pressures of war, displacement, and empire. And while Albright represents to many the arm of colonialism in the Middle East and its legacy in North American academia, the tools that he passed to biblical studies are being used to probe this very imprint of colonialism on my field. And here I point to Jesse DeGratto's scholarship on the Neo-Syrian period, which moves the study of Assyria beyond the language of domination and subversion. He offers Assyriology in biblical studies a more tempered window into the effects of empire on ancient people in the Levant, using Homi Bhabha's terminology of ambivalence, mimicry, and hybridity, and he will be speaking on this tomorrow. Now I will conclude with a few observations about the areas where our fields can work more closely together to address the broader pressures facing small fields like ours in academia, and I am very aware of the cheesiness of the title of this slide. While the increased financial pressures and the time to dissertation crunch at our respective institutions are out of our immediate control, I think that there are ways that we can survive and better prepare our students for the changing job market. I turn to a few points raised in the publication of Albright's Centennial, which was held at Johns Hopkins University, and the editors were Jerry Cooper and Glenn Schwartz. This list caught my eye because I think that all of these issues are still relevant today. Seeing that we are well into the 21st century, it seemed fitting to end my talk with this list and a note of optimism that our respective fields are carrying out this important work. Oh, excuse me, there we go. Regarding the first point, which Richard Zettler describes as the split between the study of written documents and other objects with texts in a number of languages and other material culture remains. This is an area where both of our fields are excelling. Scholars are increasingly addressing the materiality of text and the importance of social and spatial context in the production, use, and reception of textual things. Regarding the second point, interdisciplinary work in our own research, but also in how we train our graduate students, I think that the lines between our fields, while still distinct, are becoming increasingly blurred. By way of example, interdisciplinary work has transformed the study of the Amarna letters. Thanks to the petrographic analysis of much of this corpus, we can now trace the movement of scribes across the Levant. We know where they wrote their tablets. It's very exciting. I also have benefited tremendously from the application of network theory to fleshing out the relationships between the people generating this corpus. The ongoing debates about how to classify peripheral Akkadian, or whatever you want to call it today, are steeped in readings about models of linguistic change, convergence, mixed languages, everything that you can think of, and secondary language acquisition and education outside of our respective disciplines. In my own work on the Amarna corpus, I am also in debt to scholarship on sociolinguistics, literacy, and social semiotic approaches to the study of writing. And the book that I'm finishing has a whole chapter on the applications of the principles of graphic design to non-figurative text, to cuneiform tablets. I am not alone in this. All of my fellow panelists, our respondents, the organizer of this conference, I looked everyone up multiple times, and I was really happy to see that we all do work that blurs lines between disciplinary boundaries. Restructuring our graduate programs, to address the second point, number 2, is somewhat more challenging. How can we restructure our programs to reflect new theoretical models and growing data sets? We are all working, again, to quote Richard Zettler, to strike a balance between the ideal and the realistic. Yet, we still need to provide our students training as well-rounded as possible. It is true that the volume of scholarship that our students have to engage with is intimidating. While we might be tempted to tell our students to play it safe and stick to a more narrowed subtopic or field in their work, the truth is that our institutions are increasingly telling us a different story. Pure research positions are rare. Undergraduate teaching and interdepartmental collaboration are more valued than ever. This is especially true of public institutions. Our graduate students are also better served by training that impresses upon them that their fate, like ours, is bound to their ability to be adaptable and to engage with researchers outside of our fields. And to quote my colleague, Mari Leonard Fleckman, we all need to demonstrate what it is that our fields can do for the broader humanities. And we all need to be able to answer the so what question. While these economic and institutional factors are outside of our control, it is clear to me that the only way that we are going to survive is to branch out intellectually, but also by engaging with other fields in the humanities and social sciences. One way to do this is to prepare our graduate students to be socialized members of the broader academic community in the humanities. Being a socialized member of the humanities means asking research questions that reflect a genuine commitment to interdisciplinary work. In graduate training, this translates to encouraging students to read outside of our fields and outside of ancient and Eastern studies, and to think big picture about where they fit into academia. In my own program, we are encouraging our students to write dissertations that have applications and audiences outside of the narrowed study of the Hebrew Bible. Turning to point number 3, the need for collaboration with outside specialists, this is where I think Assyriology leads the way. I think about the late Bob England's many years of collaboration with the computer engineers at UCLA to create the CDLI, and also of the tremendous work that went into ORAC. And here I also offer thanks to my friend and colleague, Jake Lauinger, who just released his publication of the Amarna letters on ORAC. And I would like to note that this work was funded by a Johns Hopkins Catalyst Award. That year, he was the only professor in the humanities at Johns Hopkins to receive this award. So looking for funding, collaboration, and unusual places, that's a good place to start. I would also like to thank the group at USC that have just done tremendous work with the Northwest Semitic Inscriptions Project and Inscriptifact. And I think that we are all just increasingly indebted to these visionaries that put together text online, these huge databases and images that we all are really benefiting from, especially with COVID. Here, I'd also like to cite that there is an increase in online journals. People are taking advantage of online technology. I just noticed 2 new online journals that are specific to our field and that explicitly want interdisciplinary work. The first is AVAR, an interdisciplinary journal of life and society in the ancient Near East. It calls for research that crosses and disrupts disciplinary boundaries and draws from social, anthropological, and scientific disciplines. And the other recent online journal is Meteron, a collaboration between scholars of Assyriology, archaeology, biblical studies, and rabbinics. And my fellow panelist, Gina Konstantopoulos, is a member of this editorial board. Turning to point 4, outreach to non-specialists and to our institutions, many scholars in our respective fields are addressing this issue by harnessing more readily available online technologies for productive intellectual, academic, and social engagement. COVID has certainly demonstrated that we do not need to travel or demolish our funds or our savings to keep in contact as an academic community. I also note the important work by many scholars, not just in Assyriology or biblical studies, but in the study of the broader Near East, to offer big picture works that make what we do accessible to non-specialists. Here I think of Kara Cooney's contributions to public scholarship and outreach in Egyptology. Her 2019 book, When Women Ruled the World, was recently awarded the Nancy Lapp Popular Book Award at ASOR. And as a side note, she was trained at Johns Hopkins, is currently at UCLA. In conclusion, I think that we are in an important moment in our respective fields with regards to institutional pressures. I think that some of where we can benefit from each other is not just in scholarship, but also in the process of socialization in our mutual fields and in our survival. This is the time to sit, think, and take stock in what we can offer our students by way of hope for the future of our fields. In this process, we can all benefit from more targeted collaborations between Levantine studies, more broadly, and Assyriology, not as fields in opposition or as fields in a parasitic relationship where one group of scholars takes from the other, but as friends and collaborators who are working towards a common goal, the survival of our academic disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that insightful paper that shines a brighter light on Albright as an important American institution and his legacy in regards to our question, and indeed for suggesting rather forcefully that perhaps we should reframe it. Our final paper is offered by Gina Konstantopoulos, Assistant Professor in Assyriology and Cuneiform Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to try and get this. If I've done it properly, you should be seeing.
Yes, we see it fine.
All right, excellent. I apologize for my, as Jeff put it earlier, air traffic controller appearance. It's an attempt to block out construction noise. I'll get started by thanking the organizers of this really great conference so far and my fellow speakers for highlighting some really key issues that I'll actually try and touch on as I will go through my own talk. So my talk today will cover a somewhat extensive and at points curious ground. So generally speaking, my discussion today is focused on the question of how public-facing aspects of biblical studies considered very broadly, we'll get to that in just a second, employ ancient Near Eastern material evidence in order to bolster and promote their own narrative, and how current examples of this use can fit within a larger historical pattern of similar examples. Now, beyond this, I will also consider why Assyriology as a field should care about this, and moreover, if not more importantly, what it might stand to gain from understanding and even considering or adopting some of these techniques and tactics. Now, there are many different ways in which ancient Near Eastern material is used to serve the popular biblical narrative. One of my first interactions with this was actually while at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, serving as an art history fellow. Now, at the Metropolitan Museum, one of the frequently seen outside tour groups that occurs in the ancient Near Eastern galleries is the group known as Oasis Biblical Tours. Founded by the Jehovah's Witnesses in the 1980s, Oasis runs tours at several locations in the US, including the Getty Villa, the Museum of the Bible, DC, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They also do international tours in Israel. Their most varied offerings are in the Met with a 4-part series, beginning with an exploration of material in the ancient Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern galleries, and moving from there into medieval and modern periods, the last of which focuses its attentions on the material in the Met's American wing. Now, the Oasis Tours presents, unsurprisingly, the ancient material as context and counter to a biblical narrative. The website for their Getty tour, for example, a tour entitled One God or Many, includes such guiding questions as How real were the so-called gods of the Greeks and Romans to their worshippers? Similarly, the first of their two Met tours situate particular objects within a specific Christian narrative. This image from the Women and Her Offspring tour, for example, presents the guardian Lamassu statues here from the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, but also the map projected on the wall behind them. Having encountered this tour in the galleries a number of times, what is generally used at this point is the tour uses the map to reference Ur in light of its connection to Abraham and Sarah, recontextualizing the importance of the ancient Near East as a whole within that framework. Now, of course, visitors experience a museum in any number of often personal ways, and one can find tours in the Met run through volunteers and curators, as well as other institutions that present ancient Near Eastern material in an entirely different light, crafting a similarly entirely different narrative. But the narrative presented by Oasis is nevertheless a popular and engaging one. And moreover, it is often the main or only avenue by which many people might interact with this material. So with this overlong anecdote in mind and put to rest, I would move again to the major points of my discussion today, and from there tackle each in turn. So first, I will provide a very brief overview of the entwined history of Assyriology and biblical studies, principally within the museum and public setting. Following this, I will discuss how biblical studies has already been using ancient Near Eastern material to bolster its own public-facing narrative. And here I will caution that I am generally discussing how biblical and ancient Near Eastern material is presented through an evangelical Christian narrative, though I will say not exclusively, as evidenced by recent press coverage of the Pope's recent visit to Iraq. And finally, this talk will close with a brief analysis as to what can be gained for Assyriology by considering these methods and why such a consideration is necessary. Now, my earlier presenter, Peter, in the earlier presentation by Peter Machinist, he provided a key overview of many of the early people and events in the history of Assyriology and its development as a field, and so I will reference here only two. From the object-based perspective, perhaps some of the most prominent: the well-known Beate inscription of Darius I and the flood tablet. Now, the former is, as many are aware, a trilingual rock relief inscription found in the Kermanshah province in modern-day Iran, carved high up into the cliff face. It serves as one of the initial catalysts of interest in Mesopotamian languages and texts, and the trilingual inscription, written in Elamite Old Persian and Babylonian, the southern dialect of Akkadian, was of course key to deciphering Akkadian. As opposed to this visually quite imposing inscription, the flood tablet, currently in the British Museum, comes in at a far less striking 15 by 13 centimeters in size. The text recounts the story of the flood from tablet 11 of the Akkadian Epic of Gilgamesh. Having ventured to the ends of the earth in search of immortality, Gilgamesh finds Utnapishtim, who tells him of the massive flood meant to destroy humanity that he alone survived by building a great ark. Now, this first millennium tale is, of course, part of a longer history of its own. The excerpt in Gilgamesh borrows from the earlier tale, of Atrahasis, and the Sumerian version of the flood story is also known. Now, the story portrayed on K3375 was immediately recognizable, with parallels to the biblical account of the flood present in its smaller details as well. Utnapishtim releases birds to find evidence for land, for example. To the late 19th century public, this was seen as historical confirmation of the Bible. When George Smith, who we have already met, working in the British Museum, first deciphered the tablet in 1872, he was so overtaken with excitement that, the popular story goes, he jumped up in the museum and began to undress in his frenzy. Here was proof of biblical narrative and biblical events. Now, the public shared Smith's enthusiasm, and with that public interest came further avenues for funding. The tablet collection in the British Museum, currently identified by the Sidlam DT, is listed as such because the Daily Telegraph provided funding for Smith's 1872 excavation, conducted in the hopes of discovering more of the flood story. Now, this enthusiasm and other sources of funding carried Smith through several further excavations until his death, quite literally, in point of fact, as he contracted dysentery and died during his 1876 excavation. Now, as has already been discussed, Mesopotamia and the Bible were entwined well before Smith's discoveries. On one level, the Bible was the major avenue by which Mesopotamia was often referenced outside of classical Greek sources like Herodotus's Histories and the fragmentary history of Mesopotamia by Berossus, a Babylonian priest from the Hellenistic period. Biblical material included descriptions of Assyrian conquest, including the siege of Jerusalem. Another point of focus rested on portrayals of Babylon itself, a centrality tied to Nebuchadnezzar II's destruction of the temple and subsequent deportation of the city's population, at least in part. Now, by the mid-19th century, excavations in Iraq had uncovered the great palaces and temples of Assyria in the north, and newspapers such as the Illustrated London News ran headlines about the Nimrod sculptures just received at the British Museum, with drawings of the recent finds and sketches of well-dressed members of the public gazing in awe at a mighty lamassu, the winged human-headed bull colossus that guard the entranceways to Assyrian palaces and temple buildings and rooms, and who we saw earlier. When archaeologist August Henry Layard published a book in 1849 detailing his excavation of the city of Nineveh, it was a veritable bestseller. Similarly, the Assyrian court at the Crystal Palace brought these finds into realized, if dramatic and quite imagined, life for the public, who could, as we see, visit a full-color recreation of their glory, and here Layard offered critical and substantial input into the design. The material in the British Museum and other major institutions added new depth to the experience and relationship that visitors and the public already had with biblical material and the biblical narrative, providing an extra layer of authenticity and thus helping to manufacture what we might term a hyper-real experience. This interest carried the initial stages of excavations and their reception, particularly in Britain and France. As more textual material was translated, however, a growing scholarly discussion of Assyriological texts on their own merit began to increase. So later 19th and 20th century, as well as modern uses of Mesopotamian material, tie into, I would say, several tropes. The desire to corroborate or substantiate biblical material was indeed one of them, but we also find a long thread of Orientalist reception of the ancient Near East, and this too begins quite early. Though Byron's play Sardanapalus, for example, was written in 1821 and thus before most, if not all, of the relevant excavations, Charles Keane's 1853 staging at the Royal Princess Theatre integrated exaggerated elements of Layard's more recent finds to craft what I would only term an overblown Orientalist fantasy. Now, moving forward, the potential grandeur was met and exceeded in the silent film era, with Griffith's Intolerance, his 1916 silent film. Now, the film covered 4 parallel storylines over its nearly 4-hour-long runtime, including amongst them depictions of the crucifixion and the fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. The film was epic, expansive, and expensive in scope and scale, with much of its budget dedicated to reproducing the lavish feast and set pieces that comprised Babylon. There were 16,000 extras included in some of these shots. Such depictions were rooted in an interest in biblical imaginings and driven furthermore by an interest in the Mesopotamian events as they were specifically referenced in these contexts. To draw this into the modern stage, these sets actually, as I understand it, were the inspiration for the shopping complex at Hollywood and Highland, which unfortunately has just recently been renovated to remove the famous lamassu. So if we jump to depictions of Mesopotamia in more modern popular cultural contexts, we see that they shift to find new shapes when placed under the umbrella of biblical monotheism, a term I'm using quite deliberately here. Within this framework, ancient Near Eastern deities are often repackaged as demons, as with the netherworld plague deity Nergal, who is repurposed to act as a demonic antagonist when appearing in the long-running DC comic title Hellblazer, for example, which was also realized as film and TV adaptations. The most famous example of this type of modern reuse is undoubtedly that of Pazuzu, who serves as the demonic antagonist in the 1973 film The Exorcist. Although a demon when appearing in his native Mesopotamian context, he worked to guard and protect against the far more dangerous Lamashtu, and was thus employed to apotropaic ends. In the Exorcist film and later TV series, run by Fox in 2016 to 17, he is entirely antagonistic, reimagined to fit within a biblical framework and summarily repurposed as a demonic denizen of a more Christian, in this time decidedly Catholic, hell. Finally, I will note that the impulse to prove the Bible correct continues to this day. As observed by the Hittite-themed Twitter account Tarhuna, this express writer seems to have just stumbled across the existence of the Hittite Empire, and only a century or so late to the party. So with this in mind, I would move fully into the present day to discuss two examples in particular, namely the Creation Museum and the Museum of the Bible, in light of how ancient Near Eastern material can and has been used to further a biblical and, in this case, specifically evangelical Christian narrative. Now, the Creation Museum, which opened in 2007 in Kentucky, is the work of Ken Ham, CEO of Answers in Genesis, a Christian creation apologetics group advancing young earth creationism, and presents evidence to this end. It was joined in 2016 by a built replica of Noah's Ark called the Ark Encounter, which includes amongst its dioramas explaining life before the flood, quote unquote, detailed models of the purported Tower of Babel, and scattered amongst the papers being used to record the terrible events of antediluvian life, we may spot the shapes of several cuneiform tablets. The mentions of ancient Near Eastern, or at least an attempt at them, the mentions of ancient Near Eastern material in both of these institutions are only props without much in the way of larger context or content, and they are positioned to directly serve the narrative of either location, which, given its young earth creationist model, unsurprisingly runs to the fundamentalist side of the scale. Now, as a final note, both attractions are fairly expensive. Adult tickets to the Creation Museum are $40. The Ark Encounter runs you $50, but a combo pass will only set you back $80. The Museum of the Bible, on the other hand, positions itself as an official party line as non-sectarian, academically rigorous institution, presenting a view of the history of the Bible with a permanent exhibition on precisely that topic. In comparison to the Creation Museum, an adult ticket is a more reasonable $25. The museum, which opened in 2017 near the National Mall in Washington, D.C., was funded and founded by the Green family, the owners and founders of Hobby Lobby, and among the most prominent donors to evangelical organizations and causes in America. In discussing the Museum of the Bible, there are two concerns: the collecting practices of the Greens and the narrative of the museum and its understanding of the Bible itself. Now, the former has led, unsurprisingly, to the most immediate and relevant controversies of interest for Assyriology. But as discussed by Baden and Moss in their work on the museum, the most troubling aspect of the museum's narrative is, in fact, its conflation between the Bible and American Protestantism. To quote Moss in the Religion and Politics interview shown on the slide, "It's not really a museum of the Bible, it's a museum of American Protestantism. But our whole purpose is to show this country as a Christian country governed by Christian morality," end quote. To some degree, thus, all objects in the Museum of the Bible are positioned within this narrative and serve somewhat that end. Now, the museum's objects include a number of cuneiform texts, such as this brick of the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II on display in an exhibit entitled The History of the Bible in the Beginning. The museum also includes a long-term loan exhibition entitled The People of the Land, History and Archaeology of Ancient Israel, comprised of objects on long-term loan from the Israel Antiquities Authority. But the most significant asset, so to speak, of the Museum of the Bible is the aforementioned collecting of the Green family. Begun in 2009, the Green Collection was one of the largest private collections of biblical texts, artifact, and related material broadly incorporated or broadly defined, and it included thousands of cuneiform tablets. Now, the Greens have cited a personal lack of awareness of provenance research and best practices in their early days of collecting, and issues of provenance have, as many know, dogged the collection. A number of objects among the collection were revealed to be looted from Iraq, leading to the seizure of some in 2011 and the civil forfeiture case in 2017. The results of which required Hobby Lobby to return some 5,500 looted artifacts to Iraq and pay a fine of $3 million. Now, many of the cuneiform tablets returned at this time were, as identified by Yale Assyriologist Eckhart from the site of Iri Sagrig, which has never been exactly located or properly excavated, except perhaps by looters. The museum had to return another 11,500 objects to Egypt and Iraq in 2020 because of further provenance issues. The centerpiece of that group, as you can see on the right, was a Middle Babylonian tablet with a section of the Epic of Gilgamesh detailing Gilgamesh's dreams of Enkidu. The tablet was sold to Hobby Lobby, or the Museum of the Bible rather, by Christie's in 2014. Now, the cuneiform material intended for the Museum of the Bible is thus designed to serve this specific purpose, i.e. its specific narrative purpose, and that purpose may sometimes clearly be executed regardless of the original context of the objects themselves, as many of them lack that context. So in considering these uses of ancient Near Eastern material, particularly the last two examples discussed, one of the first responses may be, all right, fine. This is clearly something going on, but outside of the clear ramifications in regards to looting, why should Assyriology and Assyriologists care? To be sure, the historical narrative is misrepresented in the Creation Museum, but it's also reporting a narrative of young Earth creationism, and you can have your kid ride a Triceratops. So maybe the use of ancient Near Eastern material in this context is the least of our problems. But I would point out that this narrative is a popular one. There are over 300,000 visitors to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter reported each year. These numbers are somewhat unverified, as Answers in Genesis is a private foundation and thus doesn't have to release its official figures. Now, the Museum of the Bible, which engages more directly with ancient Near Eastern material, reported over 2 million visitors in the first 2 years of its operation, before it was shuttered, of course, by the pandemic. That popularity alone, I would argue, warrants our attention. Now, in the American context, moreover, the narrative presented by Christian, often evangelical uses of ancient Near Eastern collections and material may swiftly become the loudest narrative engaging with this material on a public and easily accessible level. Presenting a nuanced and historically rooted, but still publicly accessible narrative helps to balance out this use, or at least provides the option of another narrative that can be accessed and understood. And the presence of this other narrative I would present is essential. Now, as practical and ethical concerns go, the value placed on ancient Near Eastern material, because it services any of the narratives I have discussed so far, cannot be divorced from the material, by which I mean monetary value of those objects on the market. Christie sold the Gilgamesh tablet for $1.7 million. That auction was accompanied by a lavish 24-page booklet explaining the tablet's significance as a textual and cultural object. Now, Hobby Lobby has since sued Christie's, claiming they misrepresented the object's provenance. For that connection alone, that between interest and value and price, would justify our attention. Now, as a closing counter to my discussion so far, I would also state there are ways in which the connection between biblical studies and Assyriology may be used to help bolster the interest in the latter. And I'm working here still within the idea of biblical studies. Our modern popular concern is primarily a Christian, i.e. evangelical narrative. We need not always have ancient or Eastern material serve merely as added context for the former. And even then, those approaches need not be problematic or controversial, as seen in this write-up of the Penn exhibit on sacred writings, extraordinary text for the biblical world. Moreover, there are practical models for what many of these institutions are doing that may be considered, if not applied. Museum and exhibit design is complicated and difficult. It requires crafting a simple and direct narrative that encapsulates a complex topic. It is remarkably difficult to move people through an exhibit in the right way and not have them go about it in reverse order, no matter how simple you think you're making the flow. For better or worse, many of these examples have found ways to position complex objects within a simple and immediately intelligible narrative, even if we may have issues with the narrative that is presented. And previous experience, starting as far back as the early excavations and subsequent public interest, have shown the potential for public interest on a wide scale. And the current and continued appearance of the ancient Near East in popular culture furthermore demonstrates that these connections and their appeal continue to persist in the modern day. Now, to that end, I would close with a few final examples of current public-facing work that is already being done in Assyriology. Museums like the Penn Museum, the Oriental Institute, the Met, Louvre, the British Museum, among others, have continually presented public-facing narratives and experiences, both in the daily experience of the visitor in the galleries and through large shows that garner similarly large amounts of attention. This includes, for example, the British Museum's 2018 to 2019 Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria exhibition, and the Met's 2014 Assyria to Iberia show. Now, both shows garnered large crowds and large attention. Assyria to Iberia, which I will speak of being more familiar personally with it, also included sections covering connections between Assyria, related other areas of interest, and biblical material, but positioned them within a historical narrative that, if not fronted, at least equalized the two. We see also examples, of course, of initiatives engaging with scholars and public heritage work in Iraq and the Middle East. I'll speak most notably of UCLA and Eleanor Robson's The Notre Network, which was recently funded the next 10 years by a large private donation. We can also speak of initiatives, of course, further initiatives by the British Museum and other institutions that engage similarly with cultural heritage work. We can also look at public-facing and accessible translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts. Recently, in working on Enheduanna and some of her connected material, I noted that a lot of the work that touches on Enheduanna's texts, written by non-Assyriology or non-Assyriologists in some related fields, tends to use translations by Beate de Changmiader, simply because these remain the most easily accessible public-facing translations. Now, in terms of Gilgamesh, I would point to a new translation of the text coming out this fall in Yale University Press, done by Sophus Hella, with the intention of being, generally speaking, accessible to the public. I would also point to initiatives such as those by John Taylor, a curator at the British Museum, that arose out of lockdown, the Thin Edge of the Wedge podcast, where John Taylor interviews other specialists in the field in a way that is meant to be engaging and approachable to the public. We can also point to a number of more popular modern depictions. So here I would reference Martin Worthington's, when at the University of Cambridge, filming with his Akkadian students of The Poor Men of Nippur, which has since not only been placed on YouTube, but has subtitles in a wide range of languages. And beyond that, further productions like Catharsis Theatre's production of Selena Wisdom's play, Ashurbanipal, the Last Great King of Assyria, the last of her trilogy of plays dealing with the Assyrian kings. And this, of course, already has been pointed out by Alice Mandell, to say nothing of the large and increasing number of digital projects. Now, some of the avenues of public attention are, of course, out of the hands of academia. Much as I might personally wish for the sort of public attention and opportunities that a major historically grounded film or video game, Assassin's Creed Babylon, to cite a hypothetical, might provide, initiatives of that scale are a constellation of corporate and commercial concerns. But as these examples I've already cited illustrate, there is plenty of space for a popular and public narrative that positions ancient Near Eastern material as foremost, even when, or especially when, perhaps it is connected to biblical material, and places it within its own context and even on its own terms. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. That's a valuable perspective regarding the public face of our fields that highlights how they're being received by many people, and on these kind of extreme ends in many ways, from both a diachronic and a contemporary perspective. Thanks so much. Now we're going to shift, our program shifts now to our two respondents. The first of which is the Jordan H. Kapson, Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Notre Dame, Abraham Winitzer. Welcome, Avi.
Thank you. Am I being heard?
Yes.
And I will just try. Is the screen being shared when I need it?
Yes, it is.
This is what in Galicia they would have called a Groissenes. Good. Welcome everyone. Thank you to the organizers, and I'm sorry actually in retrospect that I shied away from a full-fledged contribution to the meeting, whose topic is of considerable interest to me, and more importantly, really innovative and significant. Though the chance to offer an initial response to what I've heard, what we've all heard, I trust will reveal some of my own thinking on the matter. One point that appears common to the papers so far involves the intersection of perspective, individual perspective, historical perspective, with the deeper matter at hand. In other words, the conference central question, what can biblical studies offer Assyriology, is evidently one that is approached from specific angles and settings, though these particulars do not and cannot take away from the question's overall significance, and even, as we shall see, its timelessness. Certainly, this is one lesson to be taken from its consideration in the past, as witnessed in the panorama laid out by Peter Machinist. This panorama, when one zooms in on it, reveals the widely divergent attitudes and opinions of its constituents, though the very abundance of opinions in it is itself sufficient to demonstrate that our question outweighs any one view on the topic, and none of these views, no matter the authority of its proponent, can thus claim to be the final word on the matter. This to me seems exactly correct, and as I think about it, reasonable and almost self-evident, although it hardly follows that things have developed accordingly in Assyriology or in related disciplines. To the contrary, Assyriology nowadays accepts all too often the dictates of some, admittedly formidable figures, with a lack of self-reflection that baffles at times in its slavishness. While biblical studies seems all too blithe to discard aspects of its discipline, once taken as critical but now viewed as outdated or unfashionable. Neither, certainly in the admittedly acute forms that I've described them, is a formula for long-term health. Our meeting, it seems to me, offers a welcome forum to revisit these matters and to begin to ask whether a change in course may be welcome, even advised. As it was stipulated, the issue bears more on Assyriology, though I would contend that both disciplines in the conference's title stand to gain in the bargain, and equally at that. The two papers we've just heard argue for remodelings of different sorts. I would strongly support the merits of such an undertaking, provided that it does not dismiss the wisdom of those who walked before as dated narratives, even if said wisdom is demonstrably derivative of particular historical moments or personal perspectives. In order to explain what I mean, I'd like to return briefly to two of the quote-unquote scholarly moments visited initially by Machinist. The first is the one associated with Landsberger, though I will expand briefly on it by recalling his eventual junior Chicago colleague, Leo Oppenheim. The second such moment, relating to Albright, was also noted by our opening speaker and expanded upon by Alice Mandell. With these in mind, I will try in closing to offer an example of the manner by which future Assyriological work can build on a meaningful tribute from biblical studies. But let me turn first off to these so-called moments. And let me share a screen. The first, as noted, involves the tantalizing case of Landsberger's Eigenbegrifflichkeit, a term that for the purposes of an answer to our meeting's question translates precisely from the German to nada, zip or nil. Properly, or better essentially, Landsberger's famous essay leads many to believe that biblical studies have ought to have nothing to offer true Assyriology. Yes, of necessity, the latter discipline may have initially leaned on the Bible, or better, Hebrew. Though Assyriology, said Landsberger, should strive for an internal approach so as to enable reaching those meaningful inner truths and systems within a Mesopotamian culture, in a rather Kantian manner, I should add, for someone who would have scoffed, if not eaten alive, anyone making that claim of him. This, I suppose, is how one might explain how it was that a mere 5 years after his famous manifesto saw light, Landsberger found no problem, and here you can see this in the initial part of the handout, found no problem to rely heavily on Hebrew when trying to disentangle a semantic web, as that relating to the verb tzahu in Akkadian. For as recognized by many, from Aristotle to Freud, defining humor is no laughing matter, especially when one recognizes the proximity between concepts such as Hebrew tzachak, to laugh, tzavach, maybe to cry aloud, tza'ak, perhaps to holler, etc. And you can see Landsberger having no problem with the Hebrew there. But surely, however, in time, when wolf would dwell with lamb and nations would know no war, and Mesopotamia's Volschatz fully unpacked, he said, one would no longer need to turn to Hebrew and its writings. The fruits of this dream appeared to culminate in the work of another Assyriological pace setter, an Eigenbegrifflichkeit apostle, Leo Oppenheim, for whom Mesopotamian civilization, for whom Mesopotamia's description by Landsberger as an alien culture was not enough. In his mind, only a quote-unquote dead civilization would do. And indeed, one finds good evidence in Mesopotamia, in his book, Ancient Mesopotamia, for me, by far the most significant individual word on Mesopotamia and Assyriology's self-definition of the Bible's role in this project. So what might you think can the Bible offer Assyriology for Oppenheim? The answer, which you can see initially here, is even less than nothing. For an invitation to the Bible or its study for the purposes of Mesopotamia's understanding is for Oppenheim an invitation for trouble. Examples of which you can see in number 1 through 2, for instance, in which he minces, Oppenheim that is, no words concerning the Bible's corrosiveness for any such endeavor. You can see contempt and hate and all sorts of things of that sort. Only that elsewhere and more commonly, we'll have a look at 3 and 4, the Bible, exactly the reverse sentiment creeps in, with the Bible defining various aspects of Mesopotamia, small as here, or in number 5, even large. As you see there, fleshing out what is arguably the most intriguing question that can be asked of Mesopotamian, or indeed any civilization. One brief contribution from Oppenheim from 1968 that I found fitting for today might surely have been pleasing to the fading eyes of our second aforementioned figure, William Albright. The two, by the way, admired each other greatly, with Albright exerting considerable effort to bring Oppenheim to succeed him in Baltimore. This is a brief study of the biblical imagery of the eyes of the Lord, which for Oppenheim reflects a biblical theologization of a political institution, specifically the sea of mindful eyes spying on the human king, well known in Mesopotamia. 5 years earlier, the Albrightian school could claim a very similar, if more spectacular insight from the pen of Bill Moran, whose, quote, ancient Near Eastern background of the love of God in Deuteronomy also pointed to political realities between the Deuteronomic command to love, indeed culminating all the way in the Christian agape. Now, we've already heard considerably this afternoon, and I can stop sharing at this point, about Albright, although the issue at hand for us here is not only whether his style of comparatism bears merit today, but also whether it can be applied in the reverse direction sought for by our meeting, that is, with the potential of the Bible shedding light on Mesopotamia. An affirmative answer to this question, I have no doubt, was recognized by Albright and his disciples. It does not take much to realize, for instance, that an insight such as Moran's could easily be flipped around so as to ask to what extent divine love was a theological premise in polytheistic Mesopotamia, and if so, what this would mean for that civilization's religious thinking. Similar such queries could doubtlessly be posed for many turns in the road of Albright's quote-unquote historical process. Now, a Geistesgeschichte of this sort may not be fashionable today, and the term that I just used, not pleasing to Albright's ear, but what is fashionable and what is significant are very different things. And given our meeting's future orientation, I will not spend time expanding on Albright's thinking about Mesopotamia or whether or not he was sympathetic to Hegelianism of the sort I've just alluded to. Peter Machinist can no doubt do this peerlessly on one foot for weeks, perhaps all the way until Pentecost. Rather, I wish I could have Peter's face here to see whether I've made him smile, but okay. Rather, in the few minutes that remain, what I should like to do is to try and adopt this reverse Albrightian perspective, but in a manner oriented to the future. And rather than pontificating abstractly, I would like to do this by appealing to a concrete example, well known to all. Indeed, from, as we've heard, from arguably the greatest intersection the two fields have to offer. I have in mind the incomparable parallel celebrated now for, as we've heard, 150 years, enabled by the flood stories. On this occasion, early on in each of the narratives. More specifically, I want to turn to the reasons the text offer for the sparing of lives of the respective lone survivors. In Genesis, we're told this owes to Noah being a tzaddik tamim in his dorot, one who walks about with God. Gilgamesh, by contrast, the story that is, does not make the claim of the survivors, quote, the survivor being upright and blameless, nor at first glance does the text say that he walked about with the gods. But this does not mean that he is not granted access to the divine realm. To the contrary, Ea, being Ea, finds a way to communicate to him a highly complex message that reveals just enough of the divine plan for this most intelligent of mortals, Atrahasis, to decipher. The barrage of riddles in Ea's speech were deemed so abstruse as to merit a 500-page Assyriological tome 2 years ago, which builds on previous opinions on these lines, though it has still not resolved all their problems, and as I will hint at the end, indeed has created some new ones. What does come through, however, perhaps more clearly than before, is a sense of why in Mesopotamian thinking it was that this individual, over against all his peers, why he was spared Enlil's wrath. And in this manner, Gilgamesh reveals what was certainly a core idea and virtue of Mesopotamian civilization, chasisu, or knowledge, or weisheit, perhaps. Accordingly, Ea's statements and riddles, which push the envelope of ancient philology, stress language in its oral and written forms, the mastery of which, as Enuma Elish makes clear, is ultimately the domain of the divine realm. And thus the ability of Atrahasis to crack Ea's code ultimately places him, for all intents and purposes, as on an immortal par with the gods themselves. This, of course, is witnessed in Atrahasis' very name, most wise, which, understood correctly as a superlative and necessarily as an implicit relative statement too, offers a startling parallel to the aforementioned explicit characterization of Noah as, quote, most righteous in his generations. One might even suggest, as I've done elsewhere, that Noah's famous characterization builds on Atrahasis' name and thereby offers another example of Mesopotamia's tribute to Israel, though it is not for this that we are here congregated. Yet this historical parallel does bear on what brings us together, I suggest, offering a supreme opportunity for comparison and reflection on Jerusalem's tribute, not only to our civilization, but to the dead one proximate to its own. The one from which in Assyriology it has been estranged. Now, we all know the famous and infamous past dealings with this problem, including the animus and triumphalism that these have occasioned. And earlier this afternoon, we've heard a bit about some of these, the chief culprits in all this. I would like to sidestep these cases and return and build on the insight of one of my, what I would call Dr. Grossväter, if one can say that, Jack Finkelstein, an Assyriologist who, if an anti-biblical microaggression or two can be pardoned, was willing to examine the garment of Torah and ask how it accentuates the Mesopotamian body, and indeed allows for its better appreciation. Reacting to different details in the flood stories, rather than those I've just mentioned, Finkelstein asked, quote, wherein lay the reputed superiority of the monotheistic system of Israel to that of the polytheistic system of Babylonia. and wondered whether we could not speak appropriately of an ethical polytheism for Mesopotamia. I myself have asked my students versions of this question, though not with the lyricism of Finkelstein's prose. And to my surprise, I've received pushback that the Bible sets the story in a framework of ethics and justice unmatched by the Mesopotamian, even if the latter is recognized for its genius. But ethics and justice, just like that. Whose justice exactly? Whence justice? By what criteria? Such questions, of which we become more aware every day, flow from the fountainheads of Western tradition, the Bible being one of the major two. Justice, in other words, including our demands for social justice in 2021 for those marginalized up to now, but also ideally those punished for their religious convictions, this justice is an issue that connects the Bible, Old Testament and New, through different eras right down to the present day. To be sure, there is an evolution in the sense of justice in this immense continuum, though this much is seen even in the biblical text itself. And if in the later musings of the Old Testament we are told that tzedakah, here meaning charity, tatzil mimavet, saves from death, could it then not be said that the lesson of Atrahasis' survival somehow related to chasisu, intelligent understanding, with Babylonians' conceptions of what is right or just? Lest you say no, that is impossible, let me quickly remind you of one connection between knowledge and justice from this world. This from Hammurabi's words on his famous learned code, intended inter alia so that the strong shall not oppress the weak. And for the man who has been wronged, chablum. Said man, we're told, is to find the law, his law in the stele, read it and examine it, and thereby calm his troubled heart, not owing to any concrete earthly redress, but rather to the small moral victory that he will realize. Mesopotamia was hardly a world then that did not expand great energy thinking about what is right, ethical, or just. To suggest otherwise is pure folly. And so what may be said of the Mesopotamian relation between knowledge and justice? Did Mesopotamian listeners of Atrahasis' tale recognize the connection of these two ideas? Did they reflect seriously about these matters and similar ones, say the relation between equity and freedom, or what beauty may be? The basic answers to these questions is obviously yes, though an elaboration concerning which, the hows, the wheres, the in what capacities, present-day Assyriology, which celebrates unconditional conceptual autonomy for itself and readily accepts the dead civilization moniker for it, is all too happy to ignore as unanswerable and thus misguided. Yet these are the questions well worth asking precisely because they are impossibly difficult, timeless questions, the sort that are in the end the ones really only worth grappling with. Indeed, they are imperative for any sense of the world, any world, the Mesopotamian being no exception. As to how to go about answering these in a philologically sound way, I too would be at an initial loss, with one exception, and this returns to biblical studies, which, given my Midwestern setting here, I suggest can offer for Assyriology its own gateway to the West, and to all the thinking that builds on and fleshes out what Oppenheim himself once described as the genius of the westernmost section of the Fertile Crescent. Via the Bible and its study, Mesopotamianists are offered a window onto questions that have not been asked in a century, if at all. Whether in raising these again, one might vindicate or refute any detail in an Albrightian type of program is irrelevant. What is critical is the conversation itself. The alternative, beyond the inevitable professional suicide, at least in North America, would render Ea's wisdom duplicitous, the Mesopotamians as morally obtuse, and their civilization, to paraphrase from Ashurbanipal, more dead than is naturally possible. This is not a recipe for scholarship. It is thus time for a remodeling project indeed for Mesopotamia, one that will result in an Assyriology that lets go of some of its exclusivism and lets in contemplations of the Geist, even if that Geist comes from the Old Testament. For the alternative, a contemplation of only the letter, or better here, the cuneiform sign, with or without brackets, quarter or full, kills. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Avi. Thank you for your thoughtful and considered response. Now our second respondent, Beate Pongratz-Leisten, professor of Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. Beate. There you are.
You'll see.
Yes, we see it and we hear you.
Let me just see where I can again start. Okay. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this very exciting event. I had originally agreed with Avi Winitzer that I should focus on Peter Machinist's talk, and so I'm sorry if I don't respond to all of them. Peter Machinist has brought to life the grand scholarly personalities, mostly biblical scholars of the past, who in the course of their careers embarked on Oriental studies and laid the foundations of Assyriology, allowing it to emerge and ultimately develop into a field in its own right. As initially it was primarily biblical scholars who published the major corpora of cuneiform texts, their nomenclature of textual genres determined the framework for the classification of texts. In this and many other respects, Assyriologists have remained on the passive side, accepting the framework established for them by another discipline. Oops. Oh, no, okay. As Robert McAdams pointed out in his epilogue to the Foxville Albright Centennial in 1991, ancient Near Eastern studies have tended to play the passive role of the consumer rather than, at least occasionally, a generator of theory. Summarizing the lectures at that conference, McAdams did, however, optimistically state that there seems to be general recognition of the need to contextualize more rigorously, to examine ancient cultural and linguistic boundaries more closely, to probe the biases of all our sources, textual, artistic, and archaeological, more systematically, to engage more fully, mindful of the widening potential and increasing complexity of new methods in interdisciplinary cooperation. Though this remark was certainly applicable to the honoree as well as the speakers of this conference, we need to ask ourselves whether 30 years later, this attitude can be rightly said to have permeated the larger scholarly discourse of ancient Near Eastern studies. I therefore would like to expand on Peter Machinist's remarks on comparative studies by asking whether cultural comparison is in fact a useful methodological approach, and if so, what actually can and should be compared. From the outset, I would like to posit that comparative studies of culture, if properly executed, figure among the greatest challenges of the discipline, since they can only be successfully performed if the scholar is knowledgeable in both cultures. The reasoning behind my claim is that, like Machinist and Albright before him, I believe that it is absolutely necessary to historically contextualize whatever texts or objects are compared with sufficient depth. Contextualizing a text or object and understanding its function and meaning within a particular context on the one hand and its ontology on the other involves more than simply treating it as an archaeological artifact. After having it positioned within a particular historical time and geographical context, it needs to be viewed from a diachronic perspective with regard to the history of its reception, and more precisely to its producers and its audience or audiences. If it is an expression of cultural memory, its status must be defined within the cultural discourse and stream of tradition. Finally, it must be set synchronically within a particular culture as well as between cultures. In the case of the latter, the researcher must determine whether it is actually the product of a certain zeitgeist or that of direct cultural contact, and whether it has channels of transmission, or whether the channels of transmission can be identified, as pointed out by Peter Machinist. In other words, the diachronic and synchronic approaches encompass the social narratives, cultural practices, and ideologies of the respective cultures, as well as tracing their intercultural contexts or interconnectivity. Such diachronic and synchronic historical positioning within the respective cultures requires observation of intertextual and interpictorial as well as intermediate relationships. That is an inquiry into the question of how not only products within the same medium, text, image, or ritual, but also cultural products that transgress a particular medium have referenced and inspired each other. The study of intertextuality, interpictoriality, and intermediality, sparked by linguistics, literary theory, art history, as well as visual and cultural studies, are approaches alien to the philological, historical, and archaeological studies of the Hebrew Bible and Assyriology. Only very recently have ancient Near Eastern scholars, particularly those of the younger generation, started engaging with these exciting methodologies. In addition to my own initial venture into intertextuality and intermediality in my 2010 study on the relationship of dreams with ritual and cultic topography in the text of The Righteous Sufferer, I would like to mention the work of Andrea Seri, Ama Annus, Selena Wism, and Johannes Bach. For the interpictoriality aspect, I refer to the work of Karen Sonik and Melissa Eppiheimer. The proceedings of the 61st Rencontre dedicated to the topic of text and image indeed contained only very few articles that engage with the question of the intermediality between text and image in a more programmatic way. I mentioned the articles by Kiefer and Mittermeier engaging with the graphic reading, as well as the contributions of Paolo Mattie, exploring the relationship between the letters to the gods and the imagery in Sargon's II palace at Dur Sharokim. Patrick Miquel investigating imagery of vases in their relationship to ritual text in the Hittite domain, and myself exploring imagery in the Tigridian area in its relationship to the Ningirsu-Ninota mythology. Moreover, in biblical as well as in ancient Near Eastern studies, anthropological approaches to monumentality, nature, and landscape have triggered inquiries into the sensual and emotional experience of human beings in their cognitive interactions with their surroundings, as explored by Sarah Kipfer, Margaret Jacques, Ainsley Hawthorne, and Anne-Caroline Rondu-Loisel, Alison Thomason, Kirsten Neumann, Jaume Pradua, and Shibei Su, Karen Sonik, to name but the most prominent scholars in this area. Let me return from my excursion into recent interdisciplinary approaches in ancient Near Eastern studies to the question posed at this conference, namely what archaeology can learn from Hebrew Bible studies. From my personal and very idiosyncratic perspective and my own interest research, I would say that with regard to the interface between polytheism and monotheism, Hebrew Bible studies have made great and exemplary strides in comparing cultural strategies and practices rather than only particular text genres. First among these are the cultural practices revolving around the Celtic statue and the book as respective carriers of identity in the ancient Near East and Israel, as examined by Karl von der Thorn in his pioneering study in his volume of collected essays on the topic, the image and the book. In it, he demonstrates how in their interaction with divinity, polytheism and monotheism shared particular cultural strategies and practices, regardless of the form assumed by divine manifestation. These common strategies included similar practices when taking oaths, going onto military campaigns with the divine image or the book heading the army, or regarding the procession of the divinity or the book during festive celebrations, borrowing the Torah just as the cult statue and cultic paraphernalia, and the divine origins of either statue or book. In the biblical case, the discovery of the book contributed considerably, not only to promoting the cultical forms of Judea, but also to advancing the Torah as religious symbol and carrier of identity. I would like to argue that the analogy between the icon and the Torah sets the stage for an exploration of the conditions that facilitated the acceptance of the book as icon. Widespread literacy, as attested in mundane economic and political affairs, may have fueled the textualization of tradition. A higher rate of literacy in itself, however, cannot account for the acceptance of the book as icon. We must look instead to the social relocation of writing from the traditional control of the state to the priest and the temple, as William Schniedewind has suggested. The fact that priests could establish a collection of laws as carrier of religious identity not only presupposes the judicial competence of the religious elite, but also the knowledge and acceptance of a law embodying divine presence by a larger community trained in interacting with the text. Scribal and exegetical activities and the teaching and publicizing of laws are separate cultural strategies. It was probably the setting of the public reading of the stipulations of international treaties in the ancient Near East that provided the template for the public teaching of the stipulations of the Torah. Research on Deuteronomy suggests that Israelite authors were familiar not only with the Assyro-Babylonian legal corpus, but also with the Assyrian vassal treaties and loyalty oaths that served as the model for the stipulations of the covenant. Moreover, the commonalities exist not only in content and in public reading. The storage of the Torah in the temple has had precedence in the Hittite and Assyrian cultural practice of keeping loyalty oaths and treaties in the temple. The complexity of these social dynamics and social practices, which generated the notion that Yahweh and his people are bound by a covenant, a belief that characterizes Israel's monotheistic religion, cannot be underestimated. Another important avenue of research lies in the textualization process of the Bible. In his groundbreaking study, How the Bible Became a Book, for example, William Schniedewind investigated Israel's gradual shift from an oral to a textual society and charted this progression by exploring historical conditions while drawing inspiration from anthropological and sociolinguistic studies. Karl van der Ton, in his book Scribal Culture and the Making of the Hebrew Bible, in turn, used the Assyrian evidence of the scholars deeply involved in the cultural production as a comparative model through which to explore the scholars' agency in the ultimate production of the book, as well as the scribal modes of text production. He understands composition as production rather than reproduction, as well as possibly also a transcription of oral tradition, of compilation, and the expansion of inherited texts, as well as the adaptation of existing texts for new audiences, and the integration of text into a more comprehensive composition. Only recently, such aspects were explored in Assyriology in the proceedings of the conference Text and Context. The cultural practice of translatability of divinity supplanting the loaded concept of syncretism was first discussed by the Egyptologist John Wilson and several decades later by Jan Assmann, before it has been meticulously explored by Mark Smith in his study on the cross-cultural recognition of the deities of other states within the context of treaty making in the ancient Near East and the Levant. Moving from the second to the first millennium, Smith traces the subsequent loss of translatability involving a sophisticated hermeneutics that retained older formulations of translatability within expressions of non-translatability and monotheism, and thus traced how the foundational myth of Israel ended up with only one deity. My final point concerns the multimodal approach recently introduced by Alice Mandell and Jeremy Smoke in their work on the monumental inscriptions at Ekron and Tel Dan and the subterranean inscriptions at Rebet el-Khum. Investigating the spatial social syntax of these texts allows them to investigate their effects on the beholder beyond linguistic communication, shifting their focus from literacy as a skill to a set of culturally determined practices embedded in power dynamics. They approach text as the product of social structures and relationships. To conclude, a comparison of cultural strategies and practices, as well as the introduction of theoretical approaches alien to the fields of ancient Near Eastern and Hebrew Bible studies, seems to be a productive venue to gain a deeper understanding of the social and cultural dynamics within these cultures, as well as with regard to their interconnectivity. And I would like to encourage the younger generation to pursue these efforts, which they have made already in this direction. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Beate, can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Oh, let me just see. Oh, stop share. Okay.
There we go. Wonderful. I now invite all of our speakers and our respondents to put their cameras on, and I want to encourage our audience to go ahead if they have questions to place them in the Q&A. But before we get that, I do want to give an opportunity for our round of speakers to respond to our respondents, and we can go in order in terms of who spoke first. So, Peter, if you'd like to respond to our respondents, you're more than welcome to.
Well, I obviously want to thank really quite sincerely and even profoundly both Avi and Beate for these very considered remarks put together, I think, in a relatively short order. They have extended my rather pedestrian approach to comparison considerably in terms of the theoretical reaches of what comparison is and is not. And I suppose that marks me, at least among this immediate group, as the oldest and therefore the most remote. I feel at times like perhaps Lachmu and Lachamu called in to certify the sovereignty of Marduk and barely able to communicate, let alone to make the journey across the cosmic all to take part in the assembly. Just a couple of very specific points and then a more general one to both of your responses. It's interesting with regard to Leo Oppenheim, and Avi Winitzer and I have had many conversations about that, and I look forward to his book on Oppenheim very much. The second to final example that I used about the impact of biblical studies on Assyriology was taken from an article I published long ago on Assyria and its image in the first Isaiah, where the last paragraph was a quotation from the same book of Oppenheim that Avi Winitzer used, namely Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization, where Oppenheim himself says essentially and much more lyrically what I tried to say, namely that by looking at Isaiah, you get a picture of how effective Assyrian propaganda was, at least on the ruling elites of some of the subjects. So I think your revival of Oppenheim as actually a very biblically engaged scholar is something that should be promoted, and I look forward to how you work that out. As for Beate, I'm really very grateful, first at a pedestrian level on my part, of all the bibliography you've laid out, which is terrific. In particular, I'm delighted to see how you treat Torah materially, namely the text, the physical text of Torah, as sacrosanct and as a substitute eventually for things like the temple, which were destroyed and not recoverable. And it's possible, and I think now it's antecedent really in the way the treaty documents are kept in temples. My impression is that this whole business of treaties and Deuteronomy and Exodus miss the power of the temple as conferring a sacrosanct quality on the treaty document, the physical document itself, as something sacred. That I think is a real gain in study. My last point is a reference to an article that I did not mention and which so far has not popped up in our discussions this afternoon, which I had occasion just to look again. And this is this rather famous article of Jean Bottereau in defense of a useless science. The science then being Assyriology. And he ends not by trying to say it's useful in the sense of the fact that useless is the wrong adjective. Quite the contrary. Useless is what he wants to keep because in its very uselessness, he finds a use. It's a curious article because I think on the one hand, it reflects Bottereau's beginnings as a priest, and he left the priesthood to become secular, as it were, but very much the framework of his priestly education and practice in the earlier part of his life, I think, survives in this paper. And I wonder whether anybody who's had a chance to look at the paper or look again at it has a reaction to his notion here of keeping Assyriology as a useless science, or whether our present conditions in the 21st century, I mean, the article, at least in its original French version, I think goes back to the 1980s, whether this article has really been outmoded by where we are now. So I'll leave it at that.
Now, I should have mentioned you're also welcome to comment on your other paper presenters' papers as well. I'm sorry that slipped my mind. It should have been to the forefront. Do you have, if you have?
Well, no, I want to thank then both Alice Mandell and Gina Konstantopoulos for introducing dimensions that I should probably have taken some care to at least signal, which I did not. So I'm very appreciative of both of your angles. Just one very tiny point about Albright that I found. He certainly was no feminist. And there are stories about the way he put down his wife at one point publicly, who was a brilliant Sanskritist with her PhD from Hopkins as well, from the person who was probably the leading Sanskritist at the time, Maurice Bloomfield. On the other hand, he had a degree of openness, particularly to Jews and Muslims, that was highly unusual for Christian scholars of his day. Particularly anti-Semitism was an issue for him that he was very combative about. And when Johns Hopkins in the late 30s and 40s, under its president at that time, Isaiah Bowman, a well-known geographer, but also a well-known anti-Semite, sought to introduce a quota system for Hopkins undergraduates. The Jewish community of Baltimore was aghast and couldn't respond. Albright himself, evidently, in the faculty assembly, took Bowman out, and eventually Bowman had to relent on this quota system. So, and at the end of the Second War, it was Albright who recognized the Nazi phenomenon for what it was worth very early, even though Albright was in many ways a Germanophile, not a phobe. He spoke fluent German, although with a big accent, but I mean, he could extemporize lectures in German. But he then, despite rescuing people who were refugees from the Nazi world, at the end of the war, he decided you must do your best to reestablish connections. And he was in the forefront of doing so on a scholarly level. I find Albright, therefore, a very complicated figure in terms of his emotional or personal attitudes toward the field. Sorry, I've gone on too long.
Always welcome. Alice, please.
Yeah, thank you all. I really just loved everyone's talks. And I'm really glad that Peter brought up Albright's very long and complicated relationship. And particularly one of the interesting things in reading different biographies, as well as a kind of more probing of Albright's house, was that he was very much not an anti-Semitist, like he was not anti-Semitic, and he actually defended incorporating and including Jewish scholars into the publications of the Anchor Bible Dictionary Project. He pushed back against his own students in certain circumstances. And Avi has just cited in our private chat, his wife actually converted to Catholicism later in their marriage, which was a point of severe tension between them, and he wasn't happy about it. But as we see from their long marriage, he had a complex evolution as a human. So, and by no means in my talk am I attempting to demonize Albright. I just think that in light of the mark that he's had on biblical studies and on the toolkit that we use, it's really important to take a breath and sit back and think, what are we doing with this toolkit and where can we go from here? And I really thought that Avi's response about bigger questions that are asked in biblical studies, which is increasingly falling in the domains of programs that are in the study of religion, that are tied to Jewish studies programs. I think that it's treated a little bit more as kind of a catch-all category in undergraduate teaching as well. And I think that's particularly where Avi's questions about directions that Assyriology can go, that also resonates with the so what question that I mentioned in my paper and that Gina touched upon in her presentation, about how to engage people with what we do. And it is interesting. I love, again, what Peter Machinist brought about Botero and the idea of things are just interesting, and that's wonderful too. But I think just thinking very pragmatically, having had experience in public institutions for a while where funding is getting cut, part of what I think Avi's talk really did was bring out how we can engage with deeper issues that can resonate to people that are not specialists, that maybe not necessarily will get a PhD, but will still see some beauty and value in what we study. And I did appreciate too, and think it was kind of funny that his students' reaction is that the biblical flood story is about justice. And I think that that shows a very particularly passed down reception of that story, because to people, especially my undergrads, when I teach it, they're horrified. So it just shows you how this can be a talking point in the broader humanities. You know, if you're teaching a big books class or a class from religious studies, or, you know, class that touches upon philosophy, about how to integrate what we do. Beate, I was really just thankful for your talk. And I absolutely agreed with, you know, everything that you talked about. And I think what's really wonderful about your work as well, and your approach, is that it delves into interdisciplinary work in a very robust way. And I'm also reminded of kind of the intersection of texts as things, and how that ties into religious studies and material religion as well. And I also wanted to note, like James Watts and the Postscripts group that are involved in SBL, a lot of these people are not specialists in the ancient Near East. There are people that work on, LDS and the Book of Mormon, or, on other topics outside of what we do. And I found engagement with them extraordinarily productive and just fun. So, and again, Gina, I absolutely loved your talk, and I'm going to go to that museum because it looks amazing. But I thought too, what you said about how different ways that we, even just the presentation and framing of what we do in a way that's a little bit less kind of guarded, and that sometimes can be silly and fun. There's ways that we can kind of reach out and not dumb down what we do. We don't need to write on dinosaurs, but we can also find ways to present a cuneiform tablet in a way where people don't just walk by, where they stop and think and maybe kind of can engage more with the plot or the story and see different tie-ins. So that's it.
Gina, please. We're not hearing you.
Should be audible. Okay. I would just like to start by thanking my other two presenters. I really, Peter, really enjoyed your talk and your discussion of sort of the deep history of the field and the connections, and both the connections and the way that it's grown apart from those connections. And Alice, this issue of how we prepare students for a job market that is rapidly changing, and what happens when we're all obviously encountering a contraction. That's, some institutions are coming out of that financial contraction, some aren't, but what happens to programs and how programs position themselves in this present moment and in the future. I think really looking at this question of interdisciplinary connections and really reading into that. The interesting, I think, other half of that, from what I've observed from just what I'm going to loosely term academic Twitter, is how that then, to what degree that's present in hiring committees, and how, students who have done this difficult work of understanding another field and engaging with another field and in this really vital interdisciplinary work, then making sure that that's, not something that's just talked about as valuable, but is actually recognized as valuable when they're applying for positions in different institutions. And with that said, just to touch briefly, I really enjoyed you framing this sort of so what question. I'm aware that my talk went a little bit into the weeds of what I'll, term evangelical curiosities in American current culture, but I think, there's thankfully less and less now, but this idea that this isn't something that necessarily concerns Assyriology in the field is in some ways, I think, disingenuous to Assyriology as a field, because much as we may not want to be concerned with it to different degrees based on people's perspective and where they are in institutions and where they are in careers, if they're contingent, if they're not working in academia, if they're tenured or tenure track, it's certainly engaged with Assyriology, and it's engaged, it being, institutions like the Museum of the Bible, like the Creation Museum, and it's engaged with Assyriology with a backing of billions of dollars. So I guess if I had a catchphrase, it would be, we may not want to engage with it, but it's engaging with us, whether we like it or not, and that's not going to go away, and it's only going to accelerate. In many ways, I think we've seen that start to happen already, to say nothing of the ties between that and politics. And I'm speaking principally of the American landscape. But, looking at how, when we think of this so what question that you pose, looking at how it's being approached by a number of other people, I felt very remiss I didn't mention Digital Hammurabi, which has been doing a lot of these really interesting public-facing works. So I feel like I had to throw in a reference to them there. But similarly, to touch on Beate, your talk, I really appreciated and was engaged with you referencing the ways in which we can be incorporating other fields and other types of methodology in a way that helps deepen how we're presenting our own work. And ISA, of course, being an institution that has this public-facing aspect of it that functions in a number of ways. So thinking about all of the avenues by which that's possible. yeah, it's a complicated tangle, but I think thinking about how we move forward while also looking back is one of the interesting questions arising from it.
Well, it appears that our speakers have answered every possible question, if the lack of questions in the Q&A tab are telling. I do want to reopen it up briefly. We are a little over time. That's okay, because we started a little late, and I'm not bothered by that. But if Avi or Beate have something to follow up on, or Ron, if you have something you'd like to add, please. Appears everyone's waiting for dinner. Well, look, we're going to have another session tomorrow. Obviously, that one's earlier in the day. And if oh wait, I've got a Q&A. Oh, just a thanks. That's a good comment. I appreciate that very much. If you have more questions, obviously you can bring them with you tomorrow. Keep in mind that the timing is a little bit different tomorrow. And I'm going to say that this wraps up our meeting today. I would simply remind you that if you intend on attending tomorrow's gathering too, you need to register for it separately. You'll find tomorrow's registration icon at the top of that day's schedule on the conference's program schedule and registration webpage. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy. I hope you join us tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you, our presenters. I'll see you. I'll exchange some emails with you all. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your time today. All right.
Thank you for organizing this.
Yes, yes. You all made me look good. You and Ron, you're all making Ron and myself look good with such high quality stuff. Thank you.
Making us think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The hippies use the side door sign. I love it. I want one.
Oh, you like that?
I keep looking at it.
This is my son's room, and he's off. He works